I've spoken hundreds of times to all kinds of Christian groups, including evangelical groups. And then I've also spoken hundreds of times in New Age and New Thought, as well as Eastern spirituality groups. And even though these populations have radically different metaphysics and theologies, they all find the same sacred science, the same inspiring evidential worldview to be empowering. And I find that encouraging. So let's take a look at what I'm calling the evidential reformation and why I'm suggesting that you can't possibly understand religion and myth if you don't understand personification. Loyal Rue is a friend of ours and a colleague. He's written a number of books. One of them is Religion is Not About God. And what he means is that religion is about our relationship to reality. And yes, reality has been traditionally personified as the various gods and goddesses around the world. But it's talking about our relationship to what's inescapably real. I love this quote. He says, the most profound insight in the history of humanity is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality may be accepted as a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, then we will be doomed. But if we live in proper relationship to reality, right relationship to reality, then we will be saved. Now he goes on to say that all cultures throughout all time have had at least a tacit understanding of this fundamental principle. But what we're less in agreement about is how we should think about reality and what we should do to put ourselves into harmony or alignment with it. But of course that makes total sense when you realize that these two fundamental questions that all cultures have needed to address would have been answered differently at different times in human history and at different places around the world. I mean, reality 100,000 years ago in Africa is different than reality 5 years ago in New York City. It's kind of like these two questions, what's real, or how things are, and what's important, or which things matter. These questions would obviously have been answered differently all over the world. It's kind of like the 5 blind men and the elephant. You know that parable of the 5 blind guys? You know, if these were each 5 different theologians experiencing a different aspect of reality and trying to theologize on it, you'd have 5 radically different theologies. And believe it or not, religious differences are not a whole lot more complex than that. It's like, here you go, 100,000 years ago, a band or family or clan in South Africa. Reality is very different. Then what happens is chaos, drought, some difficulty occurs. They figure out that they can survive together better than they can independently, and a tribe emerges. Then you get a bunch of tribes interacting. They face some crisis, some challenge, some chaos, some difficulty. They figure out how to align the self-interest of each tribe with a new level of complexity, and a chiefdom or a kingdom emerges. This is how the world has become as complex as it is socially. And all the world's religious traditions reflect regional collective intelligence. They all reflect the plants and the animals and the terrain and the climate of that region. Those are the metaphors for reality that they use. I mean, you know, wherever you live in the world, it's like what I sometimes say when I speak to Christian audiences. I say, you know, if you and your people had never experienced sheep, the Lamb of God wouldn't be a part of your sacred story. You know, tell stories of lotus blossoms or whatever. But what we now need isn't just regional collective intelligence. We don't need just tribal collective intelligence. I mean, we need those, but they're not enough. We need global collective intelligence. We need our best globally produced answers to these questions. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble. And that's what science is. You don't understand science if you think it's just another language game. Science reflects humanity's collective intelligence globally. Now, of course, this begs the question, well, what's religion? Is religion just supernatural otherworldlyism? Is that all religion is? Well, some people claim that. I suggest to you no. Oh, by the way, this is me at the bottom of Deer Creek Falls. This actually goes up in the Grand Canyon, 140 feet. We rafted with the National Center for Science Education. We had 24, mostly scientists, 3 geologists that rafted down the Grand Canyon together for a week down the Colorado River. But religions are mythic maps of what's real and what's important. And by mythic, I mean they use personification a lot. That produce personal wholeness and social coherence. There is no religion in the world that doesn't consistently produce personal wholeness and social coherence by providing a mythic map of what's real and what's important. And provide feeling states that humans have always needed to thrive. As human beings, it doesn't matter where we live or at what time in history we live, we can't thrive if all we can do is look to the future with fear. We can thrive and we can look to the future with trust, including trusting that we're not going to be here forever. We're going to die. Human beings, same thing. No matter where you live or what your religion or philosophy or anything else, we can't thrive as human beings if all we can do is look to the past with resentment or guilt or bitterness. We can thrive and we can look to the past with gratitude. In fact, that's part of what therapy is about. It's helping people re-story, to reinterpret the past, to find something to be grateful for where before all they had was guilt or resentment or what have you. And same thing, we can't thrive as human beings if we're overwhelmed by the challenges of the day. We can only thrive when we're inspired to be in action, whatever the challenges are. Because, as we all know, compost happens. Life just throws us a pile of junk to deal with sometimes. So how do we stay inspired to be in action, whatever the challenges may be? Well, all religions get us here. Every religion in the world gets us to trust, gratitude, and inspiration via mythic beliefs. We didn't have knowledge that could get us there until recently. We now have knowledge that can get us here, but not in a way that disses or trashes religion, but in a way that can also help the religious traditions themselves to evolve. So what I mean by the evidential Reformation is three core distinctions that I think are central to what I'm calling the evidential Reformation. And just very briefly, what I mean by the evidential Reformation, in the West, where we went to for 16 centuries in terms of our primary authority, in terms of what's real and what's important, was the Catholic hierarchy, the church hierarchy. And then the Protestant reformers in the 16th century started saying, no, solo scriptura, only the Bible. So the Bible became the primary authority of what's real and what's important. Well, the secular world is known for several hundred years that evidence provides our best map of what's real and what's important, not old men or old books. And religion has been slow to catch up because of several, I'll get to that. But let me first outline what I think are the three core distinctions. The first is between factual and practical truth, or factual and practical knowledge. Day and night language, which maps out the different ways that our brain hemispheres communicate. And public revelation versus private revelation. Objective and subjective reality. So let me take these one at a time. There was a Christian church in Canada that asked me to do a whole program on sort of redefining what we even mean, what religious people mean. I mean, you don't have to use God language. But what religious people mean when they use the word God, based on an evidential worldview, not a mythic or belief-based. So I created, that song by Tina Turner, What's Love Got to Do with It? So humor me here, I created my own version. What's God got to do with it? What's God got to do with it? What's God but an ancient mythic notion? What's God got to do with it? Who needs Poseidon like tectonics made the ocean? An old mentor of mine said, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. So these distinctions will help, and again, I realize that most of us here tonight probably don't even use God language. But when I speak to religious audiences, this is an important piece because I'm talking about how to use God language for those who choose to do so in an evidential way. In fact, what I would say is the only evidence-based way. So the first is the distinction between practical knowledge and practical truth, or factual knowledge and factual truth. David Sloan Wilson, who happens to be an atheist, he also happens to be one of the world's leading evolutionary theorists, came up with this distinction, and it's really useful because practical truth is truth that if you and your culture believe it's true, you'll experience personal wholeness, social coherence, and the feeling states that humans have always needed to thrive. Factual truth is what science specializes in, but it doesn't necessarily inspire us. It doesn't necessarily work in the world unless it's interpreted in a way that does help us live more fruitful lives individually or collectively. And there's no religion in the world that is factually true, not one. But virtually every religion that's existed for any length of time is almost by definition practically true. And both of these distinctions are useful. Now, the distinction between day language and night language. Day language reflects our everyday discourse, like our daytime experience, and night language reflects our nighttime experience. And as we all know, we do things at night in our dreams that you just can't do during the day. Or if you could do them, they'd be called miraculous or supernatural. But when you fly in your dreams, you're not having a supernatural or miraculous experience. You're just having an experience that's common to the dream state. It's like, you can say it this way. Day language is just what's so. It's the facts. It's what's objectively real. It's publicly, measurably true. It's factual truth. Night language is what does it mean? It's the interpretation. It's what's subjectively real. It's personally and culturally truthful. It's practical truth. And both of these are necessary in the same way that our daytime and nighttime experiences are necessary. Did you know that if you keep any mammal from dreaming, it will die? There's something about the mammalian brain. We have to dream, it will die. We're now beginning, just in the last 6 months, we've started reading some stuff, Connie and I have been reading some stuff, in terms of we're beginning to understand why that's the case. Connie did a program about 7 years ago. There was a woman who came up to her and said that she had been reading to her 5-year-old daughter the night before, and she said, I was going to read some nonfiction at bedtime. She said about 30 seconds into it, she said, my daughter stopped me and said, no, 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 Mommy, that's a daytime book. Read me a nighttime book, Mommy. Out of the mouths of babes. Now the third distinction is the distinction between public revelation and private revelation. Private revelation is when reality reveals itself to an individual, but it comes through a person's dream or just a flash of insight or intuition. Private revelation always produces believers and unbelievers, because if I have an insight, I tell you about it, you might believe me, you might not. Public revelation is, the private revelation always produces believers and not believers. Public revelation is what's being revealed, how reality is being revealed to the entire human community. It's what science specializes in. And it's often introduced, this is the interesting thing, it's often introduced as private revelation. You know, Einstein has a vision of light, a beam of light. That's a private revelation. But then he publishes a paper and the whole scientific community goes to work trying to disprove it. The skeptical scientific method is all about discerning, is this truth claim that's being made true in an evidential way, that is in a way that Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and atheists can all agree it's true? Or is it merely said to be true because some charismatic person said it, or because it's been passed down for so many generations by tradition that we just assume it must be true? And public revelation isn't necessarily better than private revelation, but it's almost always more widely useful. More people and more diverse kinds of people can agree upon the nature of reality thanks to public revelation. This picture we took in eastern Washington. Now imagine that you lived 500 years ago and there was this enormous boulder in the middle of a field with no other mountains or anything else nearby. How would you and your culture, what would you and your people tell? What story would you tell about how that boulder got there? I mean, anything this weird or this interesting or this cool demanded a story. So not having any story was not an option. And my hunch is, God did it would have been the way most cultures 500 years ago would have talked about how that boulder got there. Now, some cultures might talk about how God brought it in on a chariot or, you know, whatever. There could be a zillion different stories about how reality brought this boulder into being. But they'd all be mythic. And they all basically start with the presumption that somehow God did it. Well, then in the 1920s, J. Harlan Bretz, a geologist, started noticing really interesting geological features in the Pacific Northwest, like all these tracts where water had clearly gone and boulders that had been dropped. And now there's not a geologist in the world that would debate. 17 times the glaciers have come south and the glaciers have come back. Just in the last 2.5 million years. 17 times glaciers have come south and back. And every time they did, they blocked the Clark Fork River, which created a dam and created glacial Lake Missoula, which was as large as Lake Superior. And what happened was, when Lake Missoula filled up, it would break the dam, and within 48 hours, all of this water would rush to the Pacific Ocean. And it got stuck in the Willamette Valley and dropped a lot of silt, which is why this is such a fertile area. It dropped boulders along the way that had been stuck in the icebergs. And as I said, there's not a geologist in the world that can now debate how these geological forms happen. There's ripple marks that are 3 stories tall. It was aerial photography in the 1960s that was a clincher. So, 500 years ago, God did it. 60 years ago, God didn't do it. It happened through natural causes. And what we're now finally able to appreciate is these are different ways of saying essentially the same thing. The words God and evolution are pointing to the same divine creative process. Both answer the question, how did we get here? How did everything get here? One uses the night language of religion, the other the day language of science. Arguing whether it was God or evolution that created everything is like debating whether it was me or my vocal cords that produced this sentence. Or like quarreling over whether it was Gaia or plate tectonics that created the oceans and the mountains. You see, it's personification. Such silly and largely unnecessary confusion will remain the norm until we celebrate personification and thereby distinguish and value practical and factual truth, day and night language, and public and private revelation. Now here's one of the theological things that I'm going to make, the claim that I'm going to be making, is that an evidential view of reality transcends belief or disbelief. It literally evaporates the theist-atheist debate. Because theism and atheism are both belief-based concepts. Theism, I believe in God, thought to be an otherworldly person. Atheism, no such thing as a God, understood as an otherworldly person. Well, could you imagine how absurd it would be if somebody said, excuse me, sir, do you believe in life? How about you, Lord? Do you believe in the universe? It doesn't matter whether we believe in life or whether we believe in the universe. We're an expression of life. We're part of the universe. Right? But what somebody says about life, that isn't believable or not. Somebody can say, life is so kind and wonderful. Somebody else says, life sucks, it's terrible. And that's believable or not, depending upon how you interpret life, right? But the fact of life just is. It doesn't matter whether we believe in reality or not. Reality is something that every plant, every animal, and every human being cannot not experience, inwardly and outwardly. That's why I love this quote from Philip K. Dick. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And for those of us that call ourselves evolutionary theologians, this is what we're pointing to, for those of us that choose to use God language, this is what we're pointing to, is a mythic personification of reality. In fact, I would suggest that there are at least 3 things that we can say confidently are real, whether we believe in them or not. Time is real. The past is real. If we act as if the future is not real, we will bring about our own extinction. And of course, the present is real. Nature is real, whether we believe in it or not. In fact, I heard somebody else say that reality is that which what you bump into in the middle of the night when you walk around with your eyes closed. But mystery is also real. Not only just the realm that we don't know, but the whole realm that we don't even know that we don't know. So at the very least, maybe more than this, but at the very least, I think what we mean, what I'm meaning by the word reality, is time, nature, and mystery. And when I use the word God, and which I do in religious circles, what I'm meaning is a personification of reality. In the same way that Uncle Sam is not the God of the U.S. government or the spirit of the U.S. government, Uncle Sam is a personification of the government. That's what I mean. And only that. Any time, any culture, any tradition, any scriptures in the world says God said this or God did that. What follows is always an interpretive personification. It's a personification of what life is doing, what reality is doing, what nature is doing, what climate is doing. There is no ancient culture in the history of humanity that we know of that didn't interpret what we today call climate as God. There is no ancient culture that didn't interpret what we call nature as God. In fact, I would say this is probably the most important slide. I would say this is absolutely the most important slide I'm going to show tonight. Ludwig Wittgenstein was a philosopher of language, and he talked about that we get tripped up because we don't understand the way language works. For example, none of these words existed for the Hebrews. In fact, none of these concepts existed for the Hebrews. These are abstractions. These are abstract words, and none of these words nor these concepts existed for most ancient peoples, and certainly not for the Hebrews. In fact, the Hebrew word for both wind and breath was ruach. Ruach Adonai, ruach Elohim. It was the Spirit of God. They personified both breath and wind as the Spirit. It's a personification, not a disembodied spirit. And you know something? When you die, you stop breathing. The Spirit leaves you. This does not have to be understood in an otherworldly woo-woo way. And of course, all of these, life, what we today mean by all this depersonalized language that we use, all of this would have existed, but they would have been interpreting it, guess how? God, the Lord. All of this stuff would have been interpreted, and interpreted as the Lord or God or Adonai or various God names. These are personifications. God is a mythic proper name for life or reality or the climate as it really is, not as you wish it was, a meaningful interpretation. Said another way, God is a personification, not a person. In fact, all gods and goddesses are personifications, not persons. And I would suggest that this is the single most important religious discovery of the last 100 years. Now, I'm going to ask, please, no whining. Because what I can count on is that the only people who tend to whine, more than the theists, because theists tend to, well, wait a second, are you saying my God is nothing but a personification? What I am saying is that whatever the word God means, yes, all gods and goddesses, with no exceptions in the history of humanity, are personifications. That is, we're giving human characteristics to something that's other than human, more than human, different than human. But atheists tend to whine too, because it takes away the argument that God doesn't exist. Because personifications don't exist or not exist, they're just personifications. That's like saying Uncle Sam doesn't exist. Could you imagine trying to convince somebody who's grown up their whole life taking Uncle Sam literally, and you're trying to say Uncle Sam doesn't exist? And of course, they're not thinking of a literal person, or maybe they are, but all the things that points to, that symbol, that metaphor points to. This is one of the reasons why there's this talking past each other in culture. I call it sometimes collective insanity, because it's kind of like, remember the language game thing? It's like we got a playground, and you got different games that are being played on the playground. You got the monkey bars and the sandbox, and in one of the places on the playground, you got theists and atheists fighting each other over does God or does God not exist. And there are bulldozers coming from across the town that are going to completely destroy, or a hurricane, or a tornado. Because we got major things like climate change and peak oil that we need to worry about, and we're fighting over whether some supernatural being exists or not. And this was considered controversial only 20 years ago. This book here, Oxford University Press, Faces in the Cloud by Stuart Guthrie. And it was so compelling that now there's an entire body of research, like 150 scholars that are part of evolutionary religious studies, and there's not a one of them that I know of that would debate or deny this. Even the evangelicals don't try to deny it. It's so compelling. It's like Poseidon was not the god of the oceans or the spirit of the oceans. Poseidon was a personification of the incomprehensibly powerful and capricious seas. Gaia was not the goddess of the earth, or the spirit of the earth, as if there was some non-material entity separate from what we call earth. Gaia was a personification of earth. Eros, or Cupid, these were personifications of lust or love, not the spirit of lust or love. And you know something? The Greeks talk about the immortality of the gods. You know why? Humans come, humans go. Humans die, humans are born, humans die. Lust is always there. Gaia is always there. Poseidon is always there. Sol or Helios, whatever you want to call this great flame. And that's why it didn't make sense to talk about, well, I don't believe in Sol, or I don't believe in Helios. Okay, whatever. That's what I'm talking about. And I get that religious people don't get personification. It's unconscious for most of them. I get that. And as long as religious people are basically claiming that there's some otherworldly entity rather than personification, we're probably going to need atheists to counter that. But I suggest that there's also a greater work that we can do, which is the work of helping to ensure humanity gets in the right relationship to reality. For example, I'm going to use night language and day language, and you're going to see both are legitimate. You can't understand how God or reality created complex life if you don't understand extinctions. You can't understand how reality or God created the healthy soils in the northern part of the world, or lakes in the northern part of the world, if you don't understand glaciers. You can't understand how reality or God created the periodic table of elements, or planets, or life, if you don't understand supernovas and red giant explosions. Watch this picture very carefully. You surely can't understand how reality, or nature, or God created continents and oceans and mountains if you don't understand plate tectonics. Folks, we've only known about this for 200 years, this for 120 years, this for 65 years, this for 55 years. This is evidentially revealed. It's public revelation. Evidence is how reality speaks. And speaks primarily through undeniable trends, not unnatural miracles. Evidence should be considered modern-day scripture. It's our main source of divine guidance today, if you want to use that language. You don't have to. So I talked briefly about the evolutionary significance of science and religion, that science is humanity's global collective intelligence. What I didn't mention is that religions have helped humanity cooperate at a larger scale than we would have instinctually. Jonathan Haidt made this point in his recent book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Differ on Politics and Religion. Chapters 11 and 12 of that book are the single best articulation of the evolutionary significance of religion that I've ever read. Because he says, if you find 50,000 insects cooperating, you can be sure that they are genetically related. You find, throughout human history, you find 50,000 human beings cooperating, you can be sure religion's there. Now, obviously, today we have secular ways that also allow us to cooperate. Sometimes working even better than religion, but not always. But when you look historically, religion has played, that's how we've cooperated at larger scale. Talking about the three faces of reality, at the very least, what I mean by God, or those of us who are evolutionary theologians, or just reality, if you just want to use secular language, time, nature, and mystery are inescapably real, fundamentally real, whether we believe in them or not. Personification, I said earlier, I think is the key to appreciating myth and religious diversity. I mean, for example, how else do you explain all these different competing stories around the world about what God or the goddess or the gods supposedly said or did? You know, it's not like reality has a multiple personality disorder. These make total sense when you get personification. In fact, I just recently reread, back in September, somebody gave us a cabin up in Canada. And I reread Martin Buber, the Jewish theologian's famous book, I and Thou. And he talked about if we treat any individual or any aspect of nature as an it to be exploited or used by us, rather than a thou to be related to in a respectful way, he said the divine is not present. We will cause our own extinction, he said, if we relate to nature as an it rather than a thou. Thomas Berry, my mentor, said it this way: the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. That is, there's an interiority that needs to be respected and honored. James Hillman, the famous psychologist, said it this way: loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify. To personify carries us into myth. In fact, Loyal Rue, the guy I quoted earlier that wrote the book Religion is Not About God, his first book was called Amythia. He said that our cultural malaise is that we are amythic. We don't have a myth. That is, we no longer relate to nature in a respectful, honorable way. We don't have a coherent myth. Sure, there's still fundamentalists that believe they're myths literally, but it doesn't cohere society. So I'm going to suggest this is one of the most useful beliefs. This is mythic, obviously. This isn't literal. This is night language. But I'm going to suggest that the belief of personifying past and future is useful. To believe that the past is rooting us on and the future is calling us to greatness is a useful belief. It's practical truth. If we act as if it's true, we're going to experience good fruit in our lives. And you know, where's Ian? You don't have a t-shirt. Earlier today, he was wearing a t-shirt that said something like, do you have a personal relationship to reality? And it had a big A for atheist, right? Because that's what non-religious people are about, usually. I mean, certainly people who are committed to science and evidence. It's about right relationship to reality. You've heard evangelicals, though, they say, do you have a personal relationship to God? Now, what they're usually meaning is some otherworldly being that they can only experience in the literature or in their imaginations. It's a fictional God. I mean, the only place you can experience Harry Potter is in the books or in your imagination, not with your senses. And I want to suggest, this is the way I talk to Christians. I say, if you don't have an honorable, an I-thou relationship to time, to nature, and to mystery, you do not have a personal relationship to God. You are deceived. If you think you have a personal relationship to God and you don't honor the past, if you're not in service to a healthy future, if you don't honor your inner nature, your outer nature, our social nature, and our interpretive nature, In other words, it's about an honorable relationship. And what fundamentalists also do is they don't honor mystery. They think they got it nailed down. To honor mystery is to be able to stand in what we don't know and be okay with that. Not pretending that we've got answers to what happens after the grave or anything like that. Thomas Berry said it this way. He said, we're talking only to ourselves. We're not talking to the rivers. We're not listening to the wind and the climate. We have broken the great conversation. And most of the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual autism. This is what unites all the indigenous peoples of the world. You know, you don't have to interpret four directions literally or the Great Spirit literally to know that personification was part of their worldview. They had an I-thou personal relationship to time, nature, and mystery. The reason is because we can't survive for very long without that. Gregory Bateson, the famous systems thinker, one of the leading intellectuals of the 20th century, he said it this way: if you imagine God as outside and separate from nature, and you think of yourself as created in the image of God, you will naturally and inevitably see yourself as about and above and outside things around you. He says, as you aggregate unrightfully all mind to yourself, you'll see the world around you as mindless and therefore not entitled to ethical or moral consideration. Your survival unit will be you and your people against the survival unit of others and the brutes and vegetables. He says, if this is your estimate of your relationship to nature, and you have an advanced technology, your likelihood of survival will be that of a snowball in hell. You will die either of the toxic byproducts of your own hate or simply from overpopulation and overgrazing. Or you could say climate change. Okay, so we took a look at the evidential Reformation and why I suggested you can't understand myth and religion if you don't understand personification. What gets in the way? What are some of the things individually, personally, and also collectively, systemically, that get in the way of us living in right relationship to reality? Why are the new atheists promoting Bible study so enthusiastically? Did you know that P.Z. Myers is the most widely read science blogger in the world? 60,000 people a day read his science blog. And this is a direct quote. P.Z. says that there's no surer way to make an atheist than to get them to actually read the Bible. Because there's all these brutal passages. In fact, if you doubt this, just put Bible stories your parents never taught you. In fact, if you have any Christians in your life or any fundamentalists, Catholics, or Protestants in your life, just invite them, find the link, Bible stories your parents never taught you. Volume 1 is the Old Testament, Volume 2 is the New Testament. It will rock them out of literalism. And Mike Earl, the guy who does it, is now atheist, and he's basically saying the best way to make an atheist is to get them to actually read the Bible. Why is traditional religion in the West shrinking and secularism growing so rapidly? And, this is really painful for evangelicals, why are rates of obesity, teen pregnancy, divorce, domestic violence, alcoholism, and porn addiction higher in religiously conservative parts of America than in more secular regions? This is a demographic fact, folks. One of my mentors, back, I was his assistant 35 years ago, he wrote a book called The Scandal, Ron Sider. He's an evangelical Mennonite. He wrote a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Conscience, which is talking about this stuff. I'm going to suggest that there's one answer to all three of these. And it can be summed up in this little cute little cartoon. Onward, steed, in search of truth, by the doctor. Going in the wrong direction. It's evidence, it's not ancient texts. So why we struggle and suffer? Oh, by the way, all the photos other than this one, Connie has taken. So all the background slides, virtually all the background slides, except a few galaxy shots, obviously. But Connie has taken as we've been traveling North America. In fact, those of you that were here early and just saw the slides changing, all those photos are from North America. In fact, Connie and I personify North America. We don't call this continent North America. We personify this continent as Nora. We say we've got this intimate personal relationship with Nora. We personify Angel, our van. We personify every great soul. We sing to great soul, which is our name for the sun. We sing in the morning, hi, hi, great soul. We got this whole little ritual. Now, we obviously know that great soul, and nor don't have human consciousness, and yet we have a more intimate, yummy relationship because we consciously personify. So, why are we struggling so? Two main things. Mismatched instincts and supernormal allurements. In fact, if you only remember two things from this part of my presentation, remember these terms: mismatched instincts and supernormal allurements. This is to remind me, Connie and I have an email newsletter that we put out about 4 times a year, about once a season. It's only like 3 or 4 paragraphs, but it lets people know all the new stuff we've added to our website and other things that are happening in this religious naturalism community. So I'm going to circulate a couple of clipboards. So if you don't even have to put your name, because I don't actually enter your name, I just enter your email address. So if you put your email address down, I promise you'll never get more than 1 email a month. In fact, you can get off the list anytime you want, and it'll usually be a lot less than once a month. So let's take a quick look at mismatched instincts and supernormal allurements. Human beings have as deep and compelling instincts as any animal does. And you would not expect a wolf or a bear or an elephant to go counter to their instincts very easily. Yet we are expected to go counter to our instincts dozens of times a day. In fact, if we don't, we get really fat. We betray our spouses and all kinds of stuff. Right? And understanding the fact that our instincts evolved over millions of years to serve the survival and reproduction needs of our ancestors prior to the agricultural revolution. And every year, in the last 10,000 years, our instincts have been more and more mismatched for the conditions that we now find ourselves in. To where our instincts often, half the time sabotage us now. And understanding this can go a long way towards understanding some of the things that we find challenging and problematic about ourselves and each other. Yeah, that's exactly. Now, supernormal, Deirdre Barrett wrote a book 4 years ago called Supernormal Stimuli: How Primal Urges Overran Their Evolutionary Purpose. See, folks, in case it's not obvious, this is not food. This is a concentration of food-like items. You'll never find anything like this in the natural world. This is a concentration of food-like items that we were evolutionarily programmed to pay attention to and then to want more of. In fact, Deirdre Barrett says almost everyone will overeat if dining on supernormal stimuli. They've taken birds' eggs where you replace its normal egg with a ceramic egg or a wooden egg, and as long as it's a little bit bigger, a little bit brighter, a little bit more pronounced markings, the bird will always sit on the fake egg. Its own eggs will die. And it does it season after season after season. It never learns. This is supernormal stimuli. Bees will become addicted to cocaine. Roundworms will become addicted to nicotine. I love this quote from Deirdre Barrett. She says, "The most dangerous aspect of our modern diet arises from our ability to refine food. This is the link to drug, alcohol, and tobacco addictions. Coca doesn't give South American Indians health problems when they brew or chill it. No one's ruined their life eating poppy seeds. When grapes and grains were fermented lightly and occasionally, they presented a healthy pleasure, not a hazard. Salt, fat, sugar, and starch are not harmful in their natural contexts. It's our modern ability to concentrate things, like cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and food components, that turns them into a menace that our bodies are hardwired to crave." I mean, think about it. What was there to be addicted to 10,000 years ago? Were you going to run into some fermented berries? Hard liquor wasn't even invented until 300 years ago. And yet now, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, video games, shopping, internet porn, romance novels, news. And these are like the bigger egg. We keep sitting on this stuff. We keep wasting our times. We get addicted, or our kids or our grandkids get addicted. It's supernormal stimuli, supernormal allurements. I don't know if you saw this 2 years ago, Newsweek magazine, iCrazy, Panic, Depression, Psychosis, How Connectivity Addiction is Rewiring Our Brains. Now, I don't want to leave you with the bad news here. There is good news, which is we can finally honor reality again. For example, we all have an unchosen nature. We all have inherited proclivities. In other words, we have instincts, as I said, that are just as compelling as any animal's instincts, but our instincts are mismatched. And for really good reason. We're born with these instincts. For example, we all have cravings for sugar, salts, and fats. Why do you suppose that is? Well, it's because for 99% of human history, it wasn't easy to find sugar, salts, and fats. So having a craving for those things allowed our ancestors to survive long enough to reproduce. Yet today, we're bombarded with foods that have sugar, salts, and fats. Yet we still have the cravings as though they were rare. There's a mismatch. There's not one of us in this room, there's not a single person in this room that would be alive today if some of our ancestors weren't really, really good at storing energy. That's what fat is. Fat is stored energy so that we can survive the harsh winters and the droughts and the lean times. In fact, human beings that weren't good at storing energy as fat got lost to the gene pool. And our ancestors were so generous, they passed those genes on to us. It's our unchosen nature.
That caused the development of the brain, too.
Exactly, exactly. Testosterone. In all men and all women, this is a human universal. The higher the testosterone, the more people take risks, and the more they think about sex. In fact, you can take people who are risk-averse and hardly ever think about sex, you give them testosterone, they're going to have sex on the brain and take all kinds of risks. Connie and I stayed at the home of a couple in the San Francisco Bay Area about 5-6 years ago, and we were talking about this over breakfast one morning, and the wife confided in this, and she said that her doctor had put her on testosterone patches, and she said after 2 days, she said, I couldn't stop thinking about sex. She said, is this what guys have to deal with? Well, the answer is yes, it is actually. But it's not just guys. See, women have testosterone too, but typically men have 10 to 20 times the testosterone that women do. Now, this is a rock formation, and Connie took a photo. But some women, it plays out over a bell curve, okay? So it's not that all men have more testosterone than all women. That's not true. In fact, there are some women that have more testosterone than many guys. My daughter, for example, is life's ever-present reminder to me that there's a wisdom larger than my ego at work. I was a peace activist for much of my adult life. Take a guess at what my oldest daughter does in the world.
Military.
Yeah, exactly. She's a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. Not only that, but my daughter is the second woman in U.S. history to be on the all-Marine wrestling team. That's right, my baby girl wrestles for the Marine Corps and kicks butt. And her pacifist daddy is so damn proud of her. Now, I'm going to share 3 pictures that somebody emailed me, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody. Unfortunately, I've got to confess, this is typical male behavior. This is a statue of a buffalo, statue of a bison, and a real male adolescent moose. And here we find typical male behavior. Now, the woman who sent this, she said, is this statutory rape? Or is it merely a moose demeanor? You know what was cool? I was invited to be a speaker at Big Sky Retreat up in Big Sky, Montana, and we happened to have dinner with some people at their house. They drove us. This was only about 5 blocks from their house, this statue. I was actually able to see what this statue was. So whatever it is that we find challenging or depressing or overwhelming, whatever we're tempted by, as we all know, relationships can be difficult. And why is it that so many of our sexual scandals are about religious leaders? Like, what's this about? It's not just the politicians. Well, our understanding of human nature is at the root of all this stuff. And if these are the best concepts that we have, if these outdated terms are the best we can do in terms of talking about human nature, see, they're outdated. I'm not saying we should throw them away necessarily, but they need to be supplemented with language like mismatched instincts and supernormal awareness. And it's not just our personal issues. So many of our collective issues have an inadequate understanding of human nature at their foundation. This is one of the reasons why Connie and I are so passionate about this stuff. Now here's what I'm going to talk about from a theological perspective. This untrivializes or realizes ancient mythic insights, such as the fall of Adam and Eve and original sin. For example, prior to microscopes, before we could even see bacteria, before we even knew bacteria existed, it wasn't just difficult to understand infection, it was impossible to understand infection. Before we had telescopes, before we could even see other galaxies, when we thought that the entire Milky Way was the whole universe, right? It wasn't just difficult to understand the structure of the universe, it was impossible. Well, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, it wasn't difficult to understand an evolved brain, it was completely impossible. But what you would have understood if you've been paying close attention is what we all know through experience, which is we all say, you know, I'll do that, but we don't do it. We say, oh, I'll never do that, but we do. We say, you can count on me for that, but you sure couldn't. What's that about? Well, the fall of Adam and Eve, original sin, are spot on, accurate night language, mythic language, about what we can now speak about in a natural, factual day language. I mean, in the Christian tradition, I don't think anybody said it better than Paul. He said, I'm a slave to sin. I really don't understand myself. I have the desire to do what is good, but I don't do it. What I end up doing is not the good I want to do, but what I hate to do. What a wretched man am I. I believe that history will show that the greatest psychological and spiritual realization or revelation, however you want to talk about it, in the 20th century, was the discovery that human beings have powerful, indeed compelling instincts, just like all other animals do. And that if we don't understand, appreciate, and respectfully manage, that is, honor and harness our inherited drives, we are bound to be enslaved to them. So what I just zipped through in about 8 minutes, Connie and I I did a TEDx talk on this topic. And we have a thumb drive, a flash drive that has about 3.5 hours. All the things that we have on our Evolutionize Your Life DVD, which is all about evolutionary psychology and brain science, is also available on this. So if you're interested in this component, you can find more there. Now, systemic design flaws are things that are fundamentally in place at the societal level that force good people to do bad things, or make it really easy for good people, great people, to engage in even great evil. That's what I mean by systemic evil, systemic design flaws. For example, these 3 things have to be done. These are essential for humanity's surviving. Pollution can no longer be free or subsidized. The idea that we allow the free or subsidized polluting of the air, water, soil, and life of this planet is insane. It's literally insanity. It's collective insanity. We've got to stop it. That's why we have to tax carbon. We can't allow the free polluting of carbon pollution. The long view must guide all decision making. This idea of just doing what's going to be for the next, the quarterly report or whatever, is also promoting collective insanity. And then finally, government does have a role to play, specifically in catalyzing clean energy technology while preventing environmental destruction. So these are systemic things that has to change. Okay, so we took a quick look at the evidential reformation and the importance of personification, some of the things that get in the way of living in right relationship with reality. I want to conclude specifically on this climate focus, the Great Reckoning, and what I'm calling also the Great Homecoming. I believe that the climate crisis, in fact, I won't even say I believe, the climate crisis is the single greatest moral issue in human history. It's not just another environmental issue. It's not just another justice issue. All justice issues, we can either take action now on them or take action in another 20 or 30 years. And sure, there's suffering in between, but it's not like the difference that we make between taking action now and 30 years from now is going to make a difference 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now. But what we do or don't do in the next decade on climate change will make a difference at that scale. So this is what Connie and I woke up to climate change. I mean, obviously we've been aware of global warming for decades, but it became front and center for us. It became absolutely off the back burner and right onto the front burner when we watched this guy's TEDx talk, or a TED talk. This was done back in, well, it probably says somewhere.
It was spring of 2012.
Spring of 2012? Okay. We watched it in the fall of 2012. And so Connie edited it down. So it's actually a 15-minute TED Talk, but we've got about 7.5 minutes. But I want to share this with you because this is, I think, some of the important, this is basically the context for everything that we now do. And what I suggest will probably be the context for most of what the Unitarian Universalist Society does, or association does.
Everything we have built, we have done in this period of relative climate stability. So what we've been doing for the last couple of 100 years is digging up carbon out of the earth and throwing it up into the atmosphere and changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere, like has happened in the past, except for way fast. In geological time, the blink of an eye, we are substantially changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and all of climate science has been about what's going to happen, what is the Earth going to do in response to this. And so we've already seen that the process is underway. What would 4 degrees Celsius look like? There are a lot of papers, a lot of equations, a lot of talk and complexity. I have helpfully paraphrased it here for you to make it easier to grasp. 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise would look ugly. Among other things, that would be the hottest the Earth has been in 30 million years. Sea levels would rise at least 3 to 6 feet, and this excludes some really tail-end possibilities, but 3 to 6 feet at least. And persistent drought would cover about 40% of the currently occupied land on Earth, which would wreak havoc on agriculture in East Asia, in Africa, South America, Western US. All this combined would produce hundreds of millions of people who have been driven from their homes, either by their cities being swamped by sea level rise, or by hunger, or by all the attendant ills that come along with those things. And to boot, probably somewhere around half of the known species on Earth would go extinct. The really dangerous possibility is that what are called, the Earth has several of what are called positive feedback systems. So for instance, in Siberia, there's this permanent ice, the permafrost, and it contains a bunch of methane in it. As it melts, it releases that methane. The methane causes more warming, which melts more ice, which releases more methane. It's a self-sustaining process. Or sea ice melts. Ice is white, it reflects energy. When it melts, it becomes dark blue and absorbs more energy, which heats the oceans, which melts more ice, which creates more dark surfaces. You see, there's a number of these systems that are self-perpetuating. The danger, the great danger of climate change that towers above all these other more specific dangers is that these positive feedback systems will take on a momentum of their own that becomes unstoppable. Human beings will lose any ability to control it at all, even if we stop all our climate emissions on a dime. So this is what I mean by climate change being simple. There are many complicated and fascinating discussions to be had about what to do about it, or about what effect our actions might have on the climate and when, or which policies are best based on cost-benefit analysis. There's complexity, plenty of complexity for those of you who like complexity. But we now know, to a fair degree of certainty, that if we keep doing what we're now doing, we will face unthinkable catastrophe. That's the bumper sticker, that's the take-home message. And that, saying, I don't want to talk about that because I don't know the ins and outs, is like saying, I don't want to raise alarms about Hitler's army being 100 miles out because I don't know the thread count of their uniforms, or I don't know the average calorie intake of a German soldier. You don't need to know those things to be scared that the army's on the march and to raise alarms about it. Similarly, if we keep doing what we're now doing, we are screwed. This we know now. To stabilize temperature, and I don't mean stabilize temperature at 2 degrees, or 4 degrees, or 6 degrees, I mean to ever have a hope of ever again having a stable temperature of any kind, global climate change emissions need to peak, stop growing, peak, and start falling rapidly in the next 5 to 10 years. Every year we do not get started on this, we add, according to the International Energy Agency, an extra $500 billion with a B dollars to the price tag of what it's going to cost us to do this eventually. Every year we wait, that's $500 billion down the drain. Now, you and I look around at current politics, particularly US politics, and massive, coordinated, intelligent, ambitious action does not strike us as particularly plausible. In fact, it might strike us as impossible. But that is where we are, stuck between the impossible and the unthinkable. So your job, anyone who hears this, for the rest of your life, your job is to make the impossible possible.
What year was the talk?
Year and a half ago. That talk was a year and a half ago. Bill McKibben, the best known activist, climate change activist, and he's also been writing on the topic for 25 years, said it's simple math. We can burn less than 565 more gigatons of carbon dioxide and stay below 2 degrees Celsius warming. Anything more than that risks catastrophe for life on Earth. The only problem? Fossil fuel corporations now have 2,795 gigatons in their reserves, 5 times the safe amount, and they're planning to burn it all unless we rise to stop it. The International Panel on Climate Change, their every 7-year report that just came out just a few months ago said the same thing. 80% of the known reserves have to stay in the ground. Trust me, this is not in the business plan of the coal, oil, and gas industry. His book, Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H, he's saying we're not going to live, we'll continue to live, humans will continue to live on Earth, but it's not Earth. It's not the same planet that we lived on the last 10,000 years. And we have to get used to that. Now, I'm using the word prophet here not as somebody predicting the future or channeling some otherworldly entity, but some prophets are people who see what's real, who sense what's emerging, and then speak a word of warning to the people that says, basically, folks, we need to get right with reality or else. And I think one of the most potent modern-day prophets is James Hansen. I mean, he's been out there getting arrested lately. In fact, he's been getting arrested a lot. James Hansen is the former director of the Goddard Space Center at NASA, one of the world's most esteemed scientists. Look at this. He's recognizing these guys. They're starting to develop a friendship here, right? And why this level of activism? Well, he himself says it's because of his grandchildren. In fact, one of the other books that we have in the other room is Storms of My Grandchildren, the truth of the coming climate catastrophe, our last chance to save humanity. When I speak in Christian audiences, I say it should be considered an abomination to think of prophets as people who wrote 2,000 years ago in the Old Testament. These are the modern day prophets that we need to be paying attention to, not ancient texts. This is a little 30-second piece that he did with Amy Goodman.
These protests are what do we call civil resistance, the same way that Gandhi did. We're trying to draw attention to the injustice because this is really analogous. This is a moral issue, analogous to that faced by Lincoln with slavery or by Churchill with Nazism. Because what we have here is a tremendous case of intergenerational injustice, because we are causing a problem, but our children and grandchildren are going to suffer the consequences. And our parents didn't know that they were causing a problem for future generations, but we do. The science has become very clear, and we're going to have to move to a clean energy future, and we could do that. And there would be many other advantages of doing it. Why don't we do it? Because of the special interests and because of the role of money in Washington.
So I want to conclude this section on climate change with a 3-minute poem from a dear friend of ours, a friend and colleague. I've known this guy since 1988, Drew Dillinger. It's a poem called Hieroglyphic Stairway.
This poem is called Hieroglyphic Stairway. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? I'm riding home on the Coma train. I've got the voice of the Milky Way in my dreams. I have teams of scientists feeding me data daily and pleading I immediately turn it into poetry. I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech. I am the desirous earth, equidistant to the underworld and the flesh of the stars. I am everything already lost. The moment the universe turns transparent and all the light shoots through the cosmos, I use words to instigate silence. I'm a hieroglyphic stairway in a buried Mayan city, suddenly exposed by a hurricane, a satellite circling Earth, finding dinosaur bones in the Gobi Desert. I am telescopes that see back in time. I am the precession of the equinoxes, the magnetism of the spiraling sea. I'm riding home on the Coma train with the voice of the Milky Way in my dreams. I am myths where violets blossom from blood like dying and rising gods. I'm the boundary of time, soul encountering soul and tongues of fire. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I can't sleep because my great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the earth was unraveling? I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech.
So I invite you to ponder this question. How might the past be rooting you on? And how might the future be calling you to greatness? I just invite you to ponder that, both today, but especially over the course of this next week. Last thing I want to say on this notion of the great reckoning, the great homecoming. Now again, what I'm about to say here isn't necessarily for this kind of audience, it's more for a religious audience. The trivial and impotent notions of God and Scripture are killing us, destroying America and our world, and condemning our children and grandchildren to hell and high water. Just when religion's moral guidance has been most needed, it's been most absent. Why? Because the church has been blind and deaf to what reality or God has been revealing for centuries, largely because of what I'm calling the three idolatries: idolatry of the written word, idolatry of the otherworldly, and idolatry of beliefs. Now let me be clear, I'm not meaning bowing down to some statue. That's not what I mean by idolatry. What I mean is having as one's primary or ultimate commitment something that doesn't deserve to be, or that betrays and defiles the future. Idolatry of the written word is when you think reality's best guidance, that is our best understanding of what's real and what's important, is in ancient texts. Idolatry of the otherworldly is where you think that ultimate value, ultimate reality, ultimate whatever exists outside time and nature, rather than personified within time and nature. And idolatry of the beliefs is where you think any one belief system is the only way to right relationship to reality. Good people are dangerous, and great people can engage in great evil when their map of reality is outdated, or when they privilege ancient mythic texts over current evidential revelation. It's kind of like if you've got a GPS that hasn't been updated. You know, you're trying to, in your car, imagine trying to go from, say, St. Louis, Missouri to Portland, Oregon, and you haven't updated your GPS since 1840. You've got a map of the Oregon Trail in there. How successful do you think you're going to be trying to get to Portland? You're not. You're going to drive in a river somewhere. And yet there are tens of millions of religious people in America alone. It's not a surprise, that America isn't leading the world with regards to our response to climate change, because 1 in 3 Americans, 32% of Americans believe these are the end times anyway, so why bother? There's no sense of commitment to what the world's going to be like 100 years or 1,000 years from now if you think the end of the world is going to happen. This is what I call collective insanity. And the metaphor that I'm using with religious people is the prodigal species. We've squandered our inheritance, and now we're waking up, and hopefully we'll come back to reality. And a value of evidence over ancient texts and an honorable I-thou relationship to reality are necessary, and I suggest that personalizing or personification is the key. And again, it's different when we do it consciously or when we do it unconsciously. So I'm going to be pretty bold here. Now again, this isn't for you all. You don't use this kind of language. But when I speak to religious people, I believe it is legitimate to say, thus saith the Lord. Like reality, God is saying this to us today. So I'm just going to say these are things that I think the evidence is saying. I'm not saying I'm channeling an otherworldly entity. I'm not. And I'm not predicting the future. I'm saying that this is what the evidence, I'm suggesting that the evidence is saying this and deserves to be said with bold authority. Stop divorcing me from reality. I am reality incarnate. Facts are my native tongue. Honor evidence as Scripture. Repent of your idolatries or face hell and high water. I preached a sermon at a Baptist church in Houston, Texas. The title of the sermon was God Rebukes the Religious Right. Repent or face hell and high water. They gave me a standing ovation. I was blown away. Nature is my secular name. Obey my laws or perish. Abandon apocalyptic thinking. It's an abomination. One of the books we sell is the 3,000-year history of end times thinking and the suffering that has been caused for countless generations because of end times thinking. Purge plutocracy, that's where government is ruled by money, and end corporate personhood. And stop polluting the carbons. Stop polluting the commons. Tax carbon now. I think these are things that reality is saying to us. Can I get a praise Darwin?
Praise Darwin!
Amen! Carl Sagan said it this way. He said, a religion old or new that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. And that's what I'm suggesting is. In fact, the book that I'm right now working on is, this is a tentative title. This is probably too academic of a title. But I'm suggesting that there are tens of millions of people around the world that basically subscribe to these 6 main points. That reality is our God. That is, reality is our ultimate concern, our ultimate commitment. Evidence is our scripture. That is, evidence is our best map of reality. Big history is our creation story. Ecology is our theology. It's the science of living in right relationship to nature. Integrity is our spiritual path. Integrity, the exercises and practices that help us live in right relationship to reality. And a just and healthy future is our mission. And this isn't just something I'm saying. This is a New York Times best-selling book by Paul Hawken, How the Largest Social Movement in History is Restoring Grace, Justice, and Beauty to the World. I actually like the subtitle of the hardcover better. How the largest movement in the world came into being and why no one saw it coming. That's what I'm calling Religion 3.0. No matter what our attempts to inform, it is our ability to inspire that will turn the tides. Now, I'm almost 6'1". I'm 6 foot about ½ inch. These guys are tall. The guy on the left is John Mather. He's NASA's senior astrophysicist. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize-winner in physics. The guy on the right is Craig Mello. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize-winner in medicine and physiology. The reason that they invited me to the Library of Congress is they were doing a program together there in 2007 called The Origins and Evolution of Life in the Universe. And they both had read my book. And Craig sent me an email. He said, Michael, you got to come to the Library of Congress and get your picture taken with us. I said, you bet I did. I was in Phoenix. I went to Phoenix, from Phoenix to Washington, D.C. to have this picture taken. Here's what they said about my book. John Mathers said, the universe took 13.7 billion years to produce this amazing book. I heartily recommend it. It just doesn't get any better than that if you're an author, right? Craig Mello said, the science versus religion debate is over. A must-read for all, including scientists. Now, this never did get me on Oprah. I was hoping it was going to get me on Oprah. I did meet with the producers of Oprah about the possibility of creating a show called Soulful Science. So we'll see. But we created an 80-second book trailer I wanted to share with you. Feel free to ask any questions, but I'd also love to hear what, if anything, you can find interesting, helpful, or inspiring, or challenging. Yes?
How would you answer Dennis Figure, the talks who points out we have one of the coldest winters ever?
Yeah, there's actually one of the video clips that Connie has alerted me to is this understanding, why is it that, this polar vortex? One of the things that happens when there's less ice in the Arctic, it causes the jet stream. Instead of the jet stream doing like this, the jet stream does like this, and it actually can keep cold going way further south and warm air going way north. So for example, Anchorage, Alaska was warmer than much of the lower 48 for much of the winter. And of course we had a lot of cold weather in other parts. So it's because of the jet stream getting screwed up. Yes?
So you talked about personification being key going forward, and I'm a Christian who sees the stories in my faith symbolically and metaphorically, narratively, but something that is challenging me about what you're saying is, how do you get people to actually embrace that notion of faith? Because it's something I do, but it's pretty difficult for people to go into church and say, yes, Jesus is a metaphor and I'm going to base my life on something. It's a difficult sell.
Well, I haven't found it quite so difficult, but it is in some circles. I mean, I used to be an anti-evolutionary fundamentalist, so I actively opposed people who taught evolution. And now I travel all over North America with my atheist wife popularizing a sacred way of thinking about evolution. So clearly, reality has a sense of humor. But I think that, for example, when I speak to Christians for whom the idea of personification is a little threatening at first, I say, well, no, think about it. Christians talk about Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. In other words, Jesus, the risen Christ, is a personification of the way to right relationship to reality, the truth of reality, and the way to, and the life, the personification of life. The same thing, all the characteristics of God, you can, if you just put into Google, God's characteristics, you see that there's websites that have, dozens and dozens of characteristics of God. Those are personifications. And if people realize that it's not a lessening of their relationship to reality, it actually increases that. That's what I found. For example, when I did my TEDx talk on the brain science, I had 4 evangelicals come up to me within 2 hours of my presentation. And all 4 of them said basically the same thing, which is, I was a young earth creationist until I heard your talk. Now I've got to embrace evolution. I've just got to do it the God-honoring way. In fact, one guy said, I always thought that evolution was about Darwin, DNA, and dinosaurs. I didn't know it was about how to have a healthier relationships and a better life. I mean, any evangelical man who thinks that the reason he's tempted by internet porn is because his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple is going to be clueless about how to live in integrity. So when I speak to evangelicals or conservative Catholics, I try to focus on the practical aspects of how this understanding of reality actually benefits their life. It takes their faith from unnatural to undeniable. In fact, this is something that I obviously would never normally share this in an atheist or a humanist setting, but I'll share this with you because I do this in Christian circles all the time. Is I say, the word supernatural only came into being about 550 years ago when we started understanding things in the natural way. In fact, there was a paper in 1977, a famous paper, in the journal Ethos, the American Anthropological Society. The paper was called Supernatural as a Western Category. Because until we started understanding things in a science-based natural way, there was no need to posit a supernatural realm. Things were understood as ordinary and extraordinary, day and night experience, day and night language. And so supernatural is by definition unnatural. Anything that's supposedly supernatural is by definition unnatural. And most people find unnatural pretty uninspiring when they really stop and think about it. So this is I call my unnaturalism rap that I sometimes do in Christian churches. I say, does this really sound like the gospel, the great news to you? An unnatural king who occasionally engages in unnatural acts, supernatural interventions, sends his unnatural son to the earth in an unnatural way. He's born from an unnatural birth, lives an unnatural life, does all kinds of unnatural deeds, and is then killed naturally. He then unnaturally raises from the dead in order to redeem us from an unnatural curse brought about by an unnaturally talking snake. He then zooms off to heaven in an unnatural way to go back to an unnatural father, to sit on an unnatural throne, and to unnaturally judge the living and the dead. And if you profess to believe in all this unnatural activity, you and your fellow believers get to go to an unnaturally boring place for an unnaturally long period of time, while everybody else suffers an unnatural, torturous hell forever. Now, if the gospel, the great news, is reduced to that, is it really a surprise that the new atheists are writing bestseller lists and that 1,000 young people a day are leaving the church in America? Did you know that 1,000 people a day are leaving the church in America? That's the statistic. And if you ask why, it's the conflict with science, specifically evolution and gays and things like that. It's the conflict with science that's the number one thing that they point to. Good questions, feedback, anything that you found interesting? Yes?
My wife and I are members of the Unitarian congregation in the Midwest, and our church likes to think of itself as being very sensitive to environmental issues, global warming. There's been a major effort within the congregation to become a green congregation within the Unitarians, and we regularly have speakers that talk about peak energy, the problem with the global warming. One thing I would like to get your thoughts about is why it seems to be so much easier for even people in a liberal religious faith to try to change their investment committee policy or to try to change their congregation, but when it comes to changing their own behavior around these issues, it's very difficult.
Yeah, the reason I can say, I spent 5 years on exactly this question. I was the national trainer for what's known as the Global Action Plan Eco Team program. So I got 210 of the eco teams, teams of 5 to 8 households within a neighborhood, within a several block radius, that worked together and used this eco team workbook and helped each other use less water, drive less, compost, recycle, all the different aspects of changing their habits. And it was designed because habit change isn't easy. Precisely what you're saying is that we can have the best of intentions, but habit change typically requires 2 things. One is peer support. That's why all the recovery movements, it's peer support and accountability. And why this program worked is because, you can read a book of the 50 things that you can do to change the environment or to live more sustainably, and chances are you're not going to take more than 1 or 2 of those things. And part of it is because it lacks peer support and it lacks accountability. Why this program worked is because you sat with your neighbors and you had to voice out loud that me and my wife, we're going to do action number 3, 5, 6, 7, and 9. And then in 2 weeks, you had to meet with your neighbors again. And so the night before you met with your neighbors again, it was like, oh shit, we got to meet with our neighbors. And you start doing the actions that you said you were going to do. It's that peer support and accountability. Habit change isn't easy, unfortunately.
There's a program here in Santa Monica called Sustainable Works. Definitely for that, it's offered sometimes in the at the library for residents. I teach at the college, Santa Monica College. We have it for students there. Some professors get like to give extra credit, and that's exactly it. Is you're meeting with your peers.
Yep.
There's check off lists.
Yep, exactly, exactly. That's what works. And so that's why having covenant groups in Unitarian churches or small groups, in any way where there can be that peer support, where you're doing something together. Because if you're doing something together, there's that social support that makes it much, much easier. And especially if you put your word on the line and you say, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing, and then you've got to be accountable around it. Yeah. Yes?
Population control.
Drought's going to take care of that one. No, it's a very serious issue because population control, population exacerbates virtually every other problem.
Well, that's the main problem with this.
I wouldn't be surprised if by the year 2100, there are just a few billion people on the planet because of drought. And disease.
Less water,
Well, I feel compassion for you all. Southern California, in fact, most of California, but certainly Southern California, you guys are going to have a massive water problem in the coming decades. It could be a lot sooner than that.
it's all one in the church.
Yes.
Well, I think what you're doing is great, and I'm hoping that, these fundamentalists will be able to see this and realize this. Now, I know there's a small group of evangelical Christians who talk or sort of address it. I forget the guy's name. It's the soldier.
Yeah, Jim Wallace at Sojourners.
Jim Wallace, that's right. And they talk about stewardship, which you can find in the Bible. You can find quotes in the Bible that talk about stewardship. So that's one way of approaching those kind of people. Personally, my philosophy of life or quote religion is humanistic harmony, all that, which includes social justice and all that. But I don't know if I can talk to these people, which most of the time.
Yeah, but you're not going to be able to. Let me just interrupt. You're not going to be able to speak to evangelical. You may individuals, a few individuals, but you're not going to be effective with evangelical. It takes somebody who either is or was an evangelical who can speak that language. I'm pretty effective with those people because I used to be one of those, and I still would call myself an evangelical naturalist. I have no supernatural or otherworldly beliefs at all, not one. I'm 100% naturalist. I'm an evidentialist. But because I was a young earth creationist, because I was a Bible-believing, a Christian, I can be effective with those folks. Jim Wallace, I know Jim Wallace. These people that are doing this kind of evangelical stuff for environment is good, but I'm trying to say something so much more radical. I'm basically saying to religious people that we are betraying, we religious people, again, I'm not speaking to most of you, but when I speak to religious people, I'm saying we are betraying God and condemning future generations because of our idolatry of the written word and idolatry of the otherworldly. Now, I may take a bullet in the chest for that, but I have to say this.
Because most of them are going to say, well, God's not going to let this happen.
Yeah, that's.
They have all kinds of things like
No, they're thinking of God as a person,
and I
not as
try to
something.
say, well, I believe this is the only heaven, earth is our only heaven that we have. That's my belief as a humanist, and that,
I just want to say that 10% of Unitarian Universalists do believe in God, are Christian, and our former president was Christian, so you're making assumptions.
Well, no, I'm not making that assumption. This event was sponsored by. Yeah, and I was making the assumption because of that. I've spoken to almost 500 Unitarian churches, so I'm well aware that you've got liberal Christians and you've got other people that are comfortable with spiritual language, absolutely. So I apologize for making generalizations that just aren't accurate. Yeah. Thanks for calling me on that. Yeah.
Who gave you your rosary?
Oh, I didn't even talk about this. This is my cosmic rosary. I've got 270 of the major transformational moments in the history of the universe, represented in beads. Each bead signifies what I call a grace moment, because most of these are where breakdown or chaos catalyzes creative transformation. That's the number one thing that drives creativity in the universe, is chaos, breakdowns, and bad news. And so knowing that builds my faith. Not faith as beliefs. I don't have any religious beliefs, but I trust. I trust chaos. And part of it is I get because how essential chaos is in this process. So, and I made this myself. Okay. So let me, last question.
So there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of bad things going to happen, but we also have almost like a transcendent faith in technology's ability to save us from all this stuff. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think there are two erroneous paths that most Americans, I would say probably 80% of Americans are on one of these paths. One, and in fact, in a couple minutes here, after Ian says something, I'm going to take about 5 or 6 minutes, the last 5 or 6 minutes, and talk about the DVDs and the books that we have. But two of the books talk about these paths. One of them is the path of perpetual progress. This is technology is going to save us, things are going to get better and better and better and better, whatever. And it's because we look at the last 100 years and we see so much progress that it's like it's pretty easy emotionally to think that, to just trust that something's going to rescue our ass. Then there's the myth of the apocalypse. That the end of the world is going to happen, it's all going to hell in a handbasket, boom, just forget it. Why even bother trying to do anything? It's just all... And I think both of those are wrong. I think we're going to muddle through. And yes, we're going to experience some catastrophes. Yes, we're going to experience technological wonders, no doubt. But I think peak oil is real. And climate change is real. And just those two things alone are going to cause some real serious chaos. Now again, that chaos is likely to catalyze amazing creativity. One of the things is we're going to have to cooperate as a world. I believe that in the next 3 to 5 years, and there's a lot of evidence on this, in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we will see the dam of denial will break. There will be no climate denialists within the next 3 to 5 years. And when that happens, China, Brazil, India, America, the world will be mobilized together like we were at the beginning of World War II. And that's going to be a tremendous boom to the economy. Because we're going to see solar and wind technology go through the roof. I still don't think it's going to prevent some serious suffering. But I do think that we are going to be mobilized globally in some enormous ways.
So you're in church, so you gotta recognize what these are. I'm going to pass these around. Michael and Connie have been traveling the country for 12 years now. They do this out of their passion. They do it through the contributions of audiences like yours. Michael's going to talk to you about the things that they have to offer you. When we retire to Forbes Hall, I'm going to invite you. We have refreshments. We'd love you to stay and enjoy some fellowship and talk to Michael and Connie briefly. So I'm going to pass this around, and I'm just going to tell you a real brief story while that's going around. Yeah, we can slide it either way. So I've seen Michael speak a couple of times previously, about 4 years ago, once at Caltech and once right here in this room. And I'm sure you found him inspiring. I found him inspiring. In fact, and I'm going to speak specifically to the people who are members of this church, not my friends from Sunday Assembly and other places, but you may have noticed that for 2 years there was an RE curriculum here at this church for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, in which we were teaching the kids about the history of the universe. We started with the Big Bang, and that whole 80-second thing that he showed you about his book took my wife Marla and me 2 years to get the kids through that sort of whole story, because we're not as talented as Michael is. But that course, that universe story curriculum was launched specifically because I sat here in this room and heard Michael give a talk similar to this about 4 or 5 years ago. And that's what inspired me and Margot to take up the challenge of teaching our kids this reality, this relationship with reality, this evidentiary reformation. We began and ended each class with the question, how do we know what we know? That was our primary driver. So that's just a little side story about the kind of work that Michael and Connie do. So I'm going to pass it back to Michael. Thank you very much for coming. Please join us for refreshments and fellowship.
Tell me me a creation story more wondrous than that of a living cell forged from the residue of an exploded star. Tell me a story of transformation more magical than that of a fish hauling out onto land and becoming amphibian, or that of a reptile taking to the air and becoming bird, or that of a mammal slipping back into the sea and becoming whale. Surely, this science-based culture of all cultures can find meaning and cause for celebration in its very own cosmic creation story. Do you know where I found that quote? 15 years ago, it was on the cover. 17 years ago, it was on the cover of the National Membership Magazine of the Unitarian Universalists Association. It was on the cover of the UU World. And I was so blown out of the water, I was so impressed with that quote, I decided to track down and marry the author. And that's a true story, folks. So these books I've already mentioned. These are two of the best books on climate change, two of the climate prophets. This one here is a very hopeful book by Paul Hawken. These are three other fabulous books on climate change. Tom Friedman at the New York Times said, if you only read one book on climate change, make it this one, Paul Gilding's The Great Disruption, Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. If you want to see how evil is working in the world today, and I'm not talking about anything woo-woo or supernatural, I'm talking about this world evil, Merchants of Doubt, how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. The same scientists, the same PR companies that confused the issue for 50 years on tobacco are now doing the same thing on climate. But we don't have 50 years, folks. This is modern day evil. High Tide on Main Street, Rising Sea Level and the Coming Coastal Crisis. This is the only book that I know of in climate change that there's been no denier that's even attempted to take on this guy's argument. He's a Unitarian Universalist down in Boca Raton, Florida. But this book is fabulous. It's got nothing but 5-star reviews on Amazon. It's just amazing. Now, in terms of peak oil, some of the best peak oil people are James Howard Kunstler, The Long Emergency, and Richard Heinberg, The End of Growth. The other major author in this field is John Michael Greer. Here it is. Here are the two extremes that I talked about before. Apocalypse not. Everything you know about 2012 Nostradamus and the rapture is wrong. And this is the myth of perpetual progress, not the future we ordered. Peak oil, psychology, and the myth of progress. This guy is amazing. In fact, you'll see, I like John Michael Greer probably more than any other writer right now. I've got 3 of his books. The Ecotechnic Future. And this one here, The 5 Stages of Collapse. Sounds scary, but in terms of practical, like how to take this scary stuff in practical, these 2 books are priceless. I highly recommend them. Now, my 2 main mentors were Thomas Berry, who just died 4 years ago, and Joanna Macy, who's still alive. The great work, Our Way into the Future, and this one here, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. We actually sell more of this book than anything else, because it's basically how to take this stuff and stay inspired to be in action. My dear friend, my closest male friend in the world, Tom Atwood, Reflections on Evolutionary Activism, Essays, Poems, and Prayers from the Emerging Field of Sacred Social Change. A brilliant book. Connie and I both love this book. Becoming Intimate with the Earth, this just came out just maybe 2 months ago. It's a fabulous book on that I-thou relationship to nature. There's nothing better. And this one here, Science, Wisdom, and the Future, The Humanity's Quest for a Flourishing Earth. This is a collection of essays. I actually have the concluding essay in this book. It comes from a conference on this topic. And then finally, no discussion of reality can possibly be had without recommending this book. I can't recommend it too highly. Richard Dawkins' book, The Magic of Reality, How We Know What's Really True. It's a fabulous book. If you want to explore this kind of a sacred way of thinking about evolution more deeply, and especially if you want to share this perspective with others very, very inexpensively, what we most recommend is our flash drive, because virtually all the stuff that we have on our DVDs is available on this one little flash drive. And we give you permission to make copies. Freely burn as many copies of our DVDs as you want. Each of these is 3.5 to 4 hours of our best programs. And we have the covers up on the website. So if you have a color printer, you can print off the covers and you can make exact replicas very inexpensively. In fact, there was one of the largest Unitarian churches in the country up in Madison, Wisconsin. The minister took these two at Christmas time about 6 years ago and made 35 copies for the leadership of his church. He went to Kinko's and he had them make copies. This one here goes along. We have a study guide you can just download from the website. The first 2 hours of this DVD is a program that I delivered in Colorado Springs to a group of Christians on Tuesday night, and I gave the exact same program to a group of atheists on Wednesday night. And both groups loved the program because they did a survey, and I find that encouraging. In fact, one of the Christian young women on Tuesday night, she said, I see how this could give me a more intimate personal relationship to God than ever before. And yet one of the curmudgeonly atheists the next night said, finally a God that makes sense and one I can respect. I find this encouraging. The other 2 hours of this is where I spend 2 hours with high school girls at a Catholic Girls Academy on this notion of evolutionary Christianity, and I just let them ask questions. And they were asking some really conservative questions about the virgin birth and some really conservative stuff. So if you have any conservative Christians in your family or your friends, I highly recommend this, or if you're a conservative Christian, I recommend this as a bridge. Now again, Evolutionary Life, this entire DVD deals with evolutionary psychology and brain science. The main program that I delivered for the last 2.5 years is this one here, Inspiring Naturalism. We interviewed my son on internet gaming addiction. If you're a woman or you related to a female, I can't recommend Evolution and Infidelity, and especially this one, Modern Women with Stone Age Instincts. Connie does both of those programs, and this one here is fabulous, Modern Women with Stone Age Instincts. Now this is mostly Connie. It's got 2 of my most popular sermons, but most of this is Connie. She does a 45-minute program called Coming Home to North America. Actually, it's about 35 minutes long. She does a program called We Are Made of Stardust with Montessori teachers, teaching teachers how to teach this stuff to kids from age kindergarten through high school. And I think this is her greatest legacy, Death Through Deep Time Eyes. She takes a look at what science tells us in an inspiring way about mortality and death, the gifts and necessity of chaos and death in an evolving cosmos. For example, we now know that mountains die, continents die, oceans die. Without the death of species, there would be no complex life beyond pond scum. Without the death of fetal cells in the embryonic stage of development, we'd all be spheres. The reason we have shape is because cells die here, here, and here. Without the death of plants and animals, there would be no food. This is obvious when we think about it. Without the death of stars, there would be no periodic table of elements, no planets, no life. Without the death of elders, there would be no room for children. Death is essential on a finite planet. So what we come to see, and that Connie talks about, is that death is natural and necessary at every level of reality, and thus death is no less sacred than life. This is day language, this is night language. And honoring mortality and death can help us cherish life and leave a sweet legacy. And this was me 4 years ago. I went through a very serious bout of cancer. I had a tumor the size of my fist in my spleen. And even when I was looking at the possibility I could die in the next 6 months, and there was a period of about a month where that was definitely a possibility, I had what religious people call the peace that passes understanding. And I had it not because I was holding out hope for pearly gates. I'm a religious naturalist. It seems to me pretty clear that where I go to when I die is the same place I came from before I was born. And whether you speak of that as coming from mystery and returning to mystery, or coming from God and returning to God, or coming from nothing and returning to nothing, I think all those are legitimate ways of talking about it. But as I sometimes say, not just humorously, if where I go to when I die isn't the very same place that all other plants and animals have gone, I'm going to be pissed. And I am eternally grateful, to use religious language, that I had this experience. This is my granddaughter at the age of 16 hours, naked on my chest, wrapped up in a baby wrap. One of the highlights of my life. So again, Connie covers all of that in 1 hour and 10 minutes on this DVD here, Death Through Deep Time Eyes. It's also on the thumb drive. And then finally, the main program that I delivered for almost 3 years is called Beyond Sustainability. It's also called Evolution's Arrow. The reason that I picked 250 years is quite simple. If you compress the history of the universe into 100 years, like if you make 14 billion years equals 100 years, at that time scale, every minute is 250 years. So think about it. If we've got 100 years of trends to study, there ought to be a few things we can say about what the next minute might be like. And it's actually very helpful. I talk about how this greater complexity, greater interdependence, and greater cooperation at larger and wider scale, how this emerged over time. This is big history. And then finally, I compare basically how the mechanistic, this worldview that nature's like a complex clock and God's the clockmaker outside of it. Did you realize that that worldview didn't exist before we had pendulum clocks? It's like, duh, right? But it transformed social reality, economic and political reality. And I believe in the next 40 years, we're going to see that scale of change. I believe we've already begun to see a global democratic revolution, what I call environmental and biomimicry revolution, that is, where we mimic biology rather than mimicking machines in our redesign of law, medicine, politics, economics. And I believe we'll see a worldwide spiritual revival as all the religions not just tolerate, but wholeheartedly embrace an ecological evolutionary worldview. That's what I'm calling the evidential reformation. And again, all we're talking about is the next minute. These aren't the challenges that we might have to deal with. We're definitely going to have to deal with these things. And then what are the things that we may or may not have to deal with? But by God, if we got to deal with any of these things, they're going to be huge. This is nuclear, biological, or chemical, or genetic, nanotechnology, or robotic error or terror. Okay, this is the scary stuff. I don't leave people here. But I want people to have authentic hope. But we're not going to have authentic hope if we're in denial about what we're definitely going to have to deal with, or what we might have to deal with. But then I say, okay, what are the long-term and the short-term positive trends that we can bank on? We can trust that these trends are going to continue. In fact, some of these have existed longer than humans have ever been around. And then finally, what's the likely good news? I'm not talking about crossing our fingers and toes and praying that Jesus, the cosmic janitor, comes and cleans up the mess we made. I'm saying, what's the likely good news in the next 250 years, given current trends? And again, this is very hopeful stuff, and it's all on this DVD. The other 2 hours is where I cover these 4 gifts: how this perspective reconciles science and religion, how it transforms our views of chaos, how it evokes inspiring, empowering visions of the future, and how it broadens our circles of compassion and care. So if you get any of these, please do make copies. This right here, 11 hours, virtually everything that's on those DVDs is also on this thumb drive. Here's all it is. I'm not going to go through the details. It's just all the entire Evolutionize Your Life DVD. Climate change, Connie and I we created some videos. We have some of the best stuff we've become aware of. Neil deGrasse Tyson, this little 8-minute thing, many people have said the highlight of my evening programs for the last 3 years has been this 8-minute DVD of Neil deGrasse Tyson. Also, they did a documentary in New Hampshire on me. And Connie has 2 amazing programs on death. For 12 years, we've told people, if you get anything from us, any books or any DVDs or this thumb drive, and it doesn't meet your expectations, just send us an email. I will refund your money. You don't even have to send it back. I've made this promise for 12 years. 6 times people have taken me up on that. That's pretty damn good. We're always looking for writing retreats. So, you know, if you go to Australia once a year and you wouldn't mind us house sitting, let me know. Always looking for writing retreats. And donations can be made to The Great Story. I'd like to conclude. This is our main website, so definitely write this down or keep this in mind, thegreatstory.org. But I want to conclude with Carl Sagan, my favorite one-line piece of scripture from Carl Sagan. Science is at least in part informed worship. Thank you. There's wine, there's refreshments, there's goodies, there's cookies and stuff in the other room, and Connie's going to be back there, and that's where the books and DVDs and the thumb drive is too. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.